Hey everybody, this is the Gospel Project, Unit 2, Session 3. Today we're in Genesis chapter 24, and so what I want you to do is to pause this video, pray, ask God to speak to you, and then I want you to read as if you're reading it for the very first time, Genesis chapter 24. Be a detective, ask questions, and think, what's the big idea? What's the main point the author's trying to say? And how do we understand this in light of the story of the Bible, in light of the Gospel? And then you can continue with this video. Hey, so welcome back. So if you prayed and you read that chapter, you are ready to go. So remember, whenever you read something in the Bible, you want to understand it not only in the book that it's in. So for example, we're in Genesis, so understanding how it fits in the book of Genesis, but also in the overarching story of the Bible. And simply the Bible can be understood that it's one story. It's about God restoring the universe and humanity back to himself and to his glory. It's about the gospel. And we see this start in Genesis, Act 1. You can understand the Bible in at least 4 acts. Act 1 is creation. God created everything. He created us in his image. We were created to have a relationship with God, with each other in the midst of creation. But then Act 2, Genesis chapter 3, sin breaks God's design. And then we see Act 3, the rescue, the redemption, first mentioned in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, about someone who's going to come and defeat Satan. And that person ultimately is, we know it's Jesus. It's Jesus Christ. And the rescue, Act 3, really takes up a huge part of the Bible and about God, what God is doing to bring about his plan. And then ultimately he completes his plan in Act 4, the consummation, the restoration, where he ultimately, yes, he does restore the universe and humanity back to himself unto his glory ultimately through Christ. And so in the plan of rescue, God chose Abraham to be the start of this people group called Israel, which we learned a few sessions ago, who ultimately, Jesus is in the line of Abraham, who ultimately is a blessing, brings the blessing to the nations. And so God provided a son, Isaac. A miracle thing happened. Abraham's old, Sarah's old, they have a kid, and they have one kid. And so, but God promised many descendants, and God's plan of rescue still has to go on. Sarah just died. Abraham's getting really old, it says in Genesis chapter 24, verse 1. And so what is God going to do? And so here's the main point of this session in this chapter. It's this, that God providentially provided the right wife for Isaac to continue God's plan of rescue through the family of Abraham. Very large, it's a large sentence, but it's so rich. So think about God's providence. What is that? Simply, God's not distant from our lives. God is working, and God can use creation. God can use events. God can use individuals to bring about his purposes. And we see that so clearly, him at work in this chapter. And so first off, point 1 in verse 1 through 9 is this, that Abraham trusts that God will provide the right wife for Isaac and in the right way. And so 2 key phrases, right wife, right way. So Abraham does not want Isaac to marry a Canaanite woman. Why is that? Well, the Canaanites didn't believe in the one true God. And so if Isaac married a woman that did not believe in the one true God, he will likely be led astray. And we see that in the Old Testament when Israel goes outside of God's design in marriage. But also he wants it to be done in the right way, not in his methods. And so the servant suggests in verse 5 that, hey, if the woman doesn't want to come back with me, should I take Isaac back to the land which you came from? And Abraham's like, no. And this is so huge as well, because the land of Canaan is where God brought Abraham, and it's where Isaac needs to be to continue to live what God wants him to do. And so God brought Abraham from where he was to Canaan, and Abraham trusts that God will provide the right wife, and he'll do it in the right way. But also in verse 10 through 61, a huge chunk of the story, we see that God providentially leads Abraham's servant, Rebekah, and her family for his plan. So we see that servant goes out, he takes camels, and he prays to God very specifically, and then God answers his prayer. And we see Rebekah, she's in Abraham's extended family, which is which is according to Abraham's desire. Verse 15, she's beautiful. Verse 16, and she's a virgin. Verse 16 as well. But she's also like a servant. She's so generous, and we see that in verse 18 through 20. Like it points out that she was quickly doing these things, getting water and so forth. And the Gospel Project Leader Material points out that 10 camels potentially could drink up to 300 gallons of water. That's a lot of water, and it points out that she is carrying about 2,500 pounds of water for this stranger. That's a lot of time and effort for a stranger. So you just see the heart of Rebecca. And so the servant and Rebecca talk. The servant ends up talking with her family. Her family, Laban and Bethuel specifically, realize, hey, this is God's at work. Verse 50 through 51. And they wanted, ultimately, they wanted Rebecca to stay a few days, and the servant's persistent, and ultimately, Rebecca has the choice whether to go. And she says yes. And so this leads us to point 3 that God providentially provided Rebecca for Isaac. And I just picture it like a movie. Isaac is out in the field, and Rebecca's coming back with the servant and the camels. And he looks up, and he sees them coming back, and she sees him, and she's like, who's that? And they say it's Isaac. And then they get married, and it's just amazing what God does. Not only did he provide a wife for God's plan of rescue, ultimately bring Christ on the scene later on, but God provided a wife that Isaac loved, is said at the end in verse 67, but also it provided Isaac comfort because Sarah, his mom, died. So we just see God providentially working in this chapter, in this story. And so how do we understand this in light of the gospel? Well, we see providence, and that ultimately points us to his work with Christ. So God providentially works to bring Rebecca to Isaac, and Jesus is in that line of Abraham and Isaac, and Jesus ultimately brings about the blessing to the nations. And so we just see God's providence with that, but also love. Isaac loves his wife, which ultimately points us to Jesus' love for his church, for his bride. And so we just see how rich this story is in and of itself, but also how it points us to God's work of rescue and ultimately with Jesus. And it's just an amazing story in light of the story of the Bible. So I want you to take time, think, God, how do you want me to respond to this story in light of the gospel?